Hello and welcome to lecture number 2 of Persecution and Anthropology of Witch Hunts. And this week the lecture is entitled Anthropological Approach and Methodology. I'm your lecturer, Dr Nick Herriman, and I'm an anthropologist at Trobe University. Okay, so previously I argued that we need to study the killings of witches and sorcerers for 2 reasons. Firstly, the killings of witches and sorcerers is very much a contemporary issue. Witches and sorcerers are being killed around the world, even this year. The other reason we need to study killings of witches and sorcerers is that it provides greater insight into persecution in general. And the idea behind this unit is that by using the ideas of anthropology, we can gain a greater insight into both the killings of witches and sorcerers and persecution in general. So in this lecture, I want to look at anthropology in greater depth. And in a nutshell, I argue that anthropologists look at the world differently. So we usually say that anthropology is the study of human culture and society, or the study of what it is to be human. 4 sub-disciplines constitute anthropology. There's biological and forensic anthropology, there's linguistic anthropology, there's archaeology, and there's socio-cultural anthropology. Okay, so 4 sub-disciplines. Now what we're looking at is the last one, socio-cultural anthropology. That's the discipline I teach and research in, and from now on I'm just going to call it anthropology. So when I say anthropology, I'm referring to the specific sub-discipline of socio-cultural anthropology. What is it? Well, it's a discipline. Each discipline has its own way of thinking and researching. Students at university, especially in the early years of undergraduate life, have to learn different disciplines, and that means different ways of thinking, researching, even talking. And what makes it difficult is that the discipline of psychology and its researching and thinking and talking, or music or law, is different to anthropology. So you need to master different disciplines when you're an undergraduate. What makes anthropology more difficult is that it's problematic to say exactly what anthropology consists in. And the problem here is that anthropology is what you call a divergent discipline. What this means is that different people in any anthropology department probably will not agree on the basic elements of our unit. They couldn't agree on what you'd put, for example, in a first-year anthropology book. In spite of this lack of consensus about the basics of our discipline, I'm going to try and outline what I think some of the fundamental ideas are. Now, we could contrast the divergence of anthropology with biology. Biology is a convergent discipline. Most biologists agree on ideas such as evolution, genetics, the scientific method, experimental procedures, and so on. And this allows them to produce first-year textbooks, which most biologists agree on. Okay, so again, in spite of the lack of consensus, I'm going to outline what I think a majority opinion on what anthropology would be. First, let us consider the goal of anthropology. Ultimately, this is to understand what it is to be human, in particular in its social, cultural aspects. To understand the social and cultural aspects of what it is to be human. Now, in order to achieve this goal, anthropologists have, over the past century and longer, studied practices and beliefs in a variety of contemporary cultures. They've studied things like the origins and evolutions of these practices and beliefs, the functions of these practices and beliefs, the meanings given to them, the underlying structures to these practices and beliefs. Anthropologists have also studied things like how the practices and beliefs have been shaped by globalization, modernity, and capitalism, and also how globalization, modernity, and capitalism have been shaped by the practices and beliefs. So there's an interaction there, if you like. And there's several ideas that anthropologists have danced around for the past century. But the problem is that anthropologists share these interests with history, sociology, and perhaps other disciplines. So just that concern doesn't really explain to us what anthropology is about. So what I'm going to now argue is that anthropology is distinguished by its method and its approach. Okay, method. One thing which distinguishes anthropology is its method. Anthropology is often called the fieldwork discipline, and the way we do fieldwork is pretty much unique to anthropology. We give it a term, and that is participant observation. Participant observation requires one to, and I quote here, live with the people one studies. Live with the people one studies and learn to participate as far as possible in their lives and activities. To become thoroughly acquainted with the local way of life and to be able to use the local vernacular as one's working language. Basically, we learn the language, hang out and gossip with people for a long time, often 1 year, and find out what's important to them and how things work. So in this spirit, between 2000 and 2002, I spent a year living in a village I called Tegalgaring in Banyuwangi. And Banyuwangi is a district located at the far eastern end of the Indonesian island of Java. While I was there, I studied the killings of sorcerers. But what this implied was participating in and contributing to formal events such as religious celebrations and ritual meals, rites of passages, circumcisions, weddings, funerals, informal events like soccer, volleyball, midnight feasts, doing mundane things, giving lifts to people in my car, eating with people on the roadside, gathering around the TV, watching European soccer broadcasts, smoking by the roadside, visiting shamans, meeting alleged sorcerers, and so on, but all in the course of everyday life. So after I completed my fieldwork, I presented these findings at seminars, in journals, in a book, and right now as I'm teaching. Okay, so as I mentioned before, so that's fieldwork. Now, as I mentioned before, anthropology is a divergent discipline. Anthropologists can't even agree on the basics of the discipline. So some anthropologists, like Gupta and Ferguson, critique the idea of fieldwork. They say it's based on this separate idea of field as a backward place where dark people are studied, and home, an enlightened place where white people write about and discuss their exotic experience. And this critique that they raise has some merit, but by the same token, this critique itself can be critiqued, and that's what we like to do in anthropology. But I won't bore you with all those details, except to say that ethnography is participant observation, doubtless remains the cornerstone of the discipline of anthropology. So the way we collect data is one thing that makes anthropology unique. We do participant observation. But how do we analyse this data? That also shows the uniqueness of the discipline, because our analysis is based on the concepts of relativism, holism, and comparison. The first concept then is relativism, and this is a methodological relativism, and it's one of the hallmarks of the anthropological approach. What it means is that we suspend making moral judgments for the sake of understanding. We do not judge other beliefs and practices as wrong or right, as bad or good. What we assume, for the purposes of study at least, is that each culture is unique and cannot be judged except on its own terms. Okay, to illustrate this, we could look at Bowen's superb book, Return to Laughter. I'd highly recommend you look at this book. It's a great study of ethnography by a famous female anthropologist named Bohannon, who used Bowen as her nom de plume, her writing name. So in this book, she relates that one night, quotes, "I saw a ball of light moving slowly and steadily through the air. There was a gasp and a sighing from the people around me. It went out, not falling or dimming, just suddenly extinguished. Iluk stepped forward. Witches." He spoke the words softly. So there were witches, and a real terror of witchcraft. I wasn't perturbed by the lights. I knew they had already been reported, though very rarely, by various European observers in this part of West Africa, and I dismissed them with that comfortable tag, electrical phenomenon. I wondered then whether there were any witches, or whether people just thought there were witches. Well, what do you think? If you saw a ball of light moving through the air and suddenly extinguishing, would you say an electrical phenomenon? Do you have another kind of comfortable tag? Or would you say it's witches? Most people would provide a tag, but approaching the phenomenon from an anthropological perspective, we try to avoid this. We actually go for the second option. It's enough to think that people believe there were witches. In other words, with regard to relativism, anthropologists don't need to work out whether there really are people who can cast spells. So that's probably going to be disappointing for you if you're listening to this, to find out if witchcraft is real. I can't tell you if witchcraft is real or not. We don't bother with that question as anthropologists. We don't bother with that question as anthropologists. It's enough that people believe it's real. And then we follow the consequences of that belief. So, as Douglas writes, the reality or unreality of the cause of harm makes no difference. It is enough that the people believe in witchcraft. And this is the position of relativism that we take in this course. So that's just about the existence of witchcraft, but relativism is not only about the existence of things, but also the morality of things. Now, if we make moral judgments, for example, we might perceive violent practices of human sacrifice, circumcision, infanticide, headhunting, and we might look at these as barbarous, abhorrent, or reprehensible. And you can take a similar approach to the killings of sorcerers, which I researched in Baniwangi. And briefly, about 100 sorcerers were killed in 1998 there. 100 alleged sorcerers, I should say. Now, non-anthropologists writing about it found these killings to be, quotes, bizarre, particularly cruel and gruesome. And my moral reaction as a person was similar initially, and even at times during field work. There's nothing wrong with us having these kind of reactions. However, if we wish to really understand sorcerer and witch killings from an insider's perspective, making moral judgments is not the way to go about it. Hence, in studying witch hunts, anthropologists largely avoid taking the moral approach and opt instead for the relativist stance. And that's not really that unique. If you think about forensic scientists, forensic psychologists or forensic scientists, they don't spend their time trying to describe how morally atrocious the killer might be. Rather, they spend most of their time trying to understand the causes and patterns of behaviour. In other words, we ignore moral issues while we are doing the study. Our role is merely to explain, not to excuse or to exalt, not to judge as good or bad. And even if we did try to make moral judgments, it could become complicated. For example, while I was doing field work, I lived with people who were as good, kind, or moral or otherwise as anybody else I've ever met. And yet some of them had killed sorcerers. They believed in the reality of the sorcery. They believed that the sorcerers were killing children and adults in the neighbourhood. So they took part in the killings and or at least felt the killing of Sorcerer was right. And for most residents, it wasn't the killing of sorcerers that was bad, it was the actions of the sorcerer, him or herself, before. So which moral system is right? A Western moral system which might decry the actions, a local system which mostly approves of the actions. So you've got two contrasting moral systems there. It's not only complicated, but it's going to get in the way of analysis. For these reasons, we adopt methodological relativism in approaching cultural and social phenomena like the killing of witches. Okay, so that's relativism. That's the first hallmark of the anthropological approach. The second one is comparison. By that I mean we compare one culture with another. Actually, we don't do this explicitly. For example, if you're writing in an anthropological journal, you would be unlikely to write, in France, they often eat horses, but in America, they rarely do. You don't compare things like this, but there is an implicit comparison. For example, we might use the theoretical concept that looks at the symbolic orders regarding what can be eaten or what cannot, and this probably refers to ideas of domestication. In America, for example, domestic animals that reside in the barn and fields are the main edible meat forms. Those that reside in the house, such as the dog and the cat, cannot be eaten, while those outside the fields, such as beavers, snakes and rats, cannot be eaten either. The French have different orders which allow things like frogs, snails and horses to be eaten, as do the Chinese, who can eat dog, as do Jews and Muslim who don't eat pig, and so on. So what an anthropologist will do is not say, okay, the French eat horses and the Americans don't, how weird, but more, what are the symbolic orders that underlie the ideas of what's edible, what's domestic, etc., and what can be eaten. And that's how we go about comparing things. So that's comparison. The last element of anthropology's holy trinity is holism. Put simply, holism means you can't understand the part without understanding the whole. Holism means that we understand a cultural phenomenon in relation to the whole culture. You cannot understand witchcraft, witch killings, and so on without understanding the whole culture in which the phenomenon exists. You have to understand the whole culture before you can understand something like witchcraft or witch killings. So, if we look at the torture and trial or by ordeal of witches in Europe, we can see that we try and use torture in a larger context. For example, we can see that many illnesses in this period were treated using tools to inflict extreme pain. For example, if you were sick with something, they might stick leeches on your bottom or bleed you or do worse things. In other cases, monks chose to torture themselves voluntarily. Most civil and criminal trials for non-witchcraft also, for matters not involving witchcraft, also involve the use of ordeal and hot irons and so on. So once we understand that, the treatment of witches becomes more nuanced. Our understanding of the treatment of witches becomes more nuanced. We consider larger factors to understand a specific instance. And we could then go on to look at even more complicated ideas, like ideas of body and soul, God, Satan, illness, curing and healing. And from this larger perspective, we would gain a better understanding of the specific treatment of witches. Okay, suffice to say that all these ideas, relativism, comparison, holism, and so on, have also been critiqued by anthropologists because we're a divergent discipline. And also suffice to say that the critiques themselves can be critiqued, but I won't go into that detail. I want to move on now and discuss another important but not really definitive idea in anthropology. This is the distinction between emic and etic. Put briefly, an emic perspective is an insider's perspective, And an etic perspective is an outsider's or an international scholarly perspective. Okay, so in anthropology, you know now we value experiencing and understanding the insider's point of view, that is the emic perspectives. However, anthropologists must also take a step back in order to, quote, reflect upon some of the taken for granted rules and expectations of the social world. In other words, the etic perspective. So anthropology is made from going from the emic perspective, the insider's perspective, to the etic perspective, the outsider's perspective, going backwards and forwards and comparing them, okay? Let's consider this in relation to the story of Lain Jara. Lain Jara belonged to the Murngin. The Murngin are also known as the Yolngu. Yolngu are a group of Indigenous Australians which come from Australia's Arnhem Land. Okay, Lain Jara was a sorcerer, and he was, and I'm quoting here from Warner's Black Civilization, quotes, one of the most noted killers in the southeastern Murngin country. Now, he provides us with an emic account. This comes straight from Lain Jara's mouth. And I'll warn you, it's pretty, the first time I read this, the blood drained from my face and I was horrified. But as an anthropologist, we have to get past that feeling. So let's listen. All of us were camping at Murunga Island. By the way, this is Murunga Island, which is about 300 kilometres east of Darwin. We were looking for oysters. This woman I was about to kill was hunting for lilies that day, for the other women had gone another way to search for oysters. I carried a hatchet with me and watched her. The woman gathered her lily bulbs, then left the swamp, went back on the sandy land and lay down in the shade. She covered herself with a paper bark to keep warm because she had been in the lily pond and felt cold. Only her head came out of the bark. She could not see me. I sneaked up and hit her between the eyes with the head of my tomahawk. She kicked and tried to raise up, but she couldn't. Her eyes turned up like she was dead. I picked her up under the arms and dragged her to a mangrove jungle and laid her down. She was a young girl. I split the mangrove stick from off a tree and sharpened it. I took some jelkurk or orchid bulb first and got it ready. I did not have my spear thrower with me, so I took the handle off my tomahawk and jabbed about the skin on her mound of Venus, which was attached to her vagina, and pushed it back. I pushed the skin up to her navel. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second. If you're feeling a bit queasy now, I'm going to give it away. This is what, from an outsider's perspective, is an act of magic. In other words, from etic or outsider's perspective, this didn't happen. But I will continue. Her large intestine protruded as though it were red calico, that is cotton. I covered my arm with orchid juice. I covered the killing stick with it too. I put the stick in the palm of my hand so that I could push the point upward with my thumb. When she inhaled, I pushed my arm up in a little. When she exhaled, I stopped. Little by little, I got my hand inside her. When I touched her, finally I touched her heart. I pushed the killing stick with my thumb up over the palm, which pressed the stick against my fingers into her heart. She had a very large heart, and I had to push harder than usual. It was noontime. I said to her, "You go eat some lilies." The woman got up and walked away. She went around another way. I said to that woman, "You will live 2 days. One day you will be happy, the next day you will be sick." The woman went back to the place where I had found her. She went to sleep. I took her blood and went away. The other woman came from where they had been gathering oysters. They were talking and laughing. They awakened the girl. She picked up her lily bulbs and went back to camp with the women. The next day she walked around, played, laughed, talked, and made fun and gathered a lot of oysters and lilies. She came back to camp that night. She brought the things she had gathered into the camp. She lay down and died that night. Okay, this is what we call an emic account. It is written from the perspective of the Mungin at the time, of a specific sorcerer at the time. We could say it comes straight from the sorcerer's mouth. This isn't by itself anthropology. This is just one part of anthropology, getting the insider's perspective. The etic approach, by contrast, implies stepping back and scrutinizing these accounts from an outsider's perspective. So an etic analysis might explain this in ways that a Lainjara, the sorcerer, or other Yolngu people might not understand, but that a scholarly outsider would. For example, an etic analysis might hold that this is an unsociable impulse manifesting in a fantasy story, or this is a reflection of the patriarchal social structure of the Yolngu. As it happens, Warner's etic analysis is more profound than this, but I'll leave that for another day. For our purposes, it is enough to say that neither the emic nor the etic perspective by itself makes anthropology. Rather, the value in anthropology lies in going back and forth between them. Okay, so today I have provided an explanation of the anthropological perspective. The reason for this lecture is that I will use the anthropological perspective to analyze witch hunts and persecution. What is unique about anthropologists is that they use data obtained from participant observation fieldwork and analyze this using principles of relativism, comparison, and holism. In the next lecture, we analyze magic, witchcraft, and sorcery. I look forward